BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. And the first thing to say, as always, if you like this upload, you can hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're welcome to do so. But most importantly, at the end, please drop some comments below so we can continue the discussion. And this show now has an Instagram page, BlackBoxNed88. One more time, BlackBoxNed88. And if you follow the show on Instagram, you'll get access to a special bonus podcast talking about music, movies, daily life, and more. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. And I have to say a big thank you to all of you guys. First and foremost, big shout out to everybody in the audience. This is a requested upload. Multiple people wrote in and left comments down in the comment section below saying they wanted to hear about Donald Lee Bujok as a Zodiac Killer Suspect. And it was something that I had meant to get to a while ago, actually, but I decided to do one now because more and more people had been requesting to hear something about Donald Lee Bujok. And to begin with him, very specifically, I was sent a series of videos from an individual named Kevin Robert Brooks. Multiple people requested that, a direct response to the claims that were made by this individual, Kevin Robert Brooks, who is perhaps the largest proponent and the largest accuser of Donald Lee Bujok as the Zodiac Killer, and he has composed something called Zodiac Killer, the Montana Connection. Now, when I began to watch his videos, I saw one, and I was just trying to digest the information. And then by the time I started the second video, I was just like, I had this feeling. I was like, I remember this guy. I saw his stuff years ago. And I looked, and yes, indeed, his videos came out about 7 or 8 years ago. Yeah, I thought he was absolutely crazy with every single thing that he has said. No, that was my first impression of him years ago, talking about some of the claims, like the hidden secret meanings of the Halloween card and such, which we'll get to here. But based on everything that we've learned about the Zodiac Killer over the past couple years, I'd say no, he's not crazy. It's just there are some very bold claims about Donald Lee Bujok as a Zodiac Killer Suspect. But if the work is called the Montana Connection, what really does that mean? Well, first and foremost, we can say that Bryan Hartnell, the survivor of the Lake Berryessa stabbing on September 27th of 1969, had a full conversation with the Zodiac Killer. And Bryan Hartnell was able to recall this and put it into a transcript. And it talks very clearly about how the Zodiac Killer said that he escaped from Deer Lodge Prison in Montana. Now, we can say that Bryan Hartnell was most likely accurate in what he recalled because there is a Deer Lodge Prison in Montana, and it all seems to fall in place. Donald Lee Bujok was at Deer Lodge Prison in Montana, and he was released on December 17th, 1968, 3 days prior to the Lake Berryessa stabbing. 3 days prior to the Lake Herman Road shooting. We were talking about Bryan Hartnell with Lake Berryessa. That was on September 27th of 1969. December 20th, 1968, was the Lake Herman Road shooting, the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, the first confirmed incident in Zodiac activity. Now, on the Zodiac Killer channel, which has an excellent documentary called Obsession into Darkness, mind you, but in one of their videos on Donald Lee Bujok, they mentioned that a lot of people think it's very, very questionable that Donald Lee Bujok would have been released from prison or been out of jail December 17th of 1968 and then made it to San Francisco on December 20th and committed the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. The only thing that I will say about that is humanly possible. It is humanly possible. It might have been difficult for him to do it, but it is humanly possible to go from Montana to San Francisco in 3 days. And the things that Kevin Robert Brooks really wants to bring up is Donald Lee Bujok did have connections to California. He had previously served in the military, and that was done in California, so he wouldn't have been an absolute stranger. San Francisco, California, that wouldn't have been just some random place to unleash this reign of terror. Another interesting thing that I learned was Edie Edwards, the very famous, I guess you'd say just true crime persona is probably the best way to describe Edward Wayne Edwards. He was also stationed, or imprisoned rather than stationed, at Deer Lodge Prison in Montana. And he unloaded some things for us, talking about how he knew Donald Lee Bujok. And Bujok made comments about killing people and that these people would be reborn in an afterlife in paradise as his slaves. So you got some guy named Donald Bujok who is making claims that he wants people who are going to be slaves in the afterlife, directly in correlation with the 408 cipher, as well as a possible solution to the 340 cipher. And I don't know how much you guys would look into that, but there is a possible solution to the 340 cipher where simply, if you look at the very center of it, a 9x9 square, it says slaves paradise. Paradise spelled P-A-R-A-D-I-C-E, paradise, and slaves. It intersects, and then there are other words, by rope, by knife, by gun, by fire. It can be found in the 340 cipher. And thanks to citing in on the Zodiac Killer, I learned that comes from something that was tied to the Tim Holt comics, which is a series of Western comics, I believe. I'd never heard of them prior to the Zodiac Killer. And it's something called the Wheel of Death, which actually features, just like that, on the cover of this Tim Holt comic, there is a Wheel of Death that says, by rope, by knife, by gun, by fire. The thing is, though, this guy, Kevin Robert Brooks, had something very similar in his presentation about the Halloween card that we mentioned. And this is the one that was sent to Paul Avery, but he misspelled his name, Paul Averly. And there's a very particular symbol in the top left-hand corner. And, I mean, kind of where the return address should be. And one possibility for that symbol is that it's a series of Celtic letters put together. But Kevin Robert Brooks believes that it actually means that veteran 4F. And Donald Lee Bujok was a 4F. 4F is the discharge number, right? If I said that correctly. But so he was a veteran who was a 4F discharge, and that is a symbol and a clue to his identity. And the whole thing about the Halloween card is it contains clues to the Zodiac Killer's identity. And this is why perhaps I thought that the guy was crazy years ago. You open it up and it says Boo, B-O-O on this Halloween card. And the guy's name is what? Bujok. And I'm like, oh my God, even hearing this now, I was like, really, dude? I mean, I really appreciate all of the research that this guy did, talking about how Donald Lee Bujok was 5'9.5", although his driver's license said that he was 5'11". I really appreciate that this guy, Kevin Robert Brooks, interviewed so many family members of Donald Lee Bujok. And in the future, I think that it would be very valuable to just look into some of the crimes that he committed, because with the Zodiac Killer mystery, you really find that a lot of these individuals are criminals, and they're very connected to the true crime world, and they've committed some very major crimes. And it would be very valuable to just try and learn about those as much as we can, just for the sake of learning more about true crime. And Donald Lee Bujok does not seem like a peach. In fact, he seems like he was pretty cold and pretty evil. And somebody even left a comment about this on one of Kevin Robert Brooks's uploads, and he said that if this guy was not the Zodiac Killer, then he was the Zodiac Killer's twin. And I'm very tempted to believe something like that, because, I mean, even if he wasn't indeed connected directly to all of these things with the Zodiac Killer mystery, he seems like someone who has a very similar personality, very similar psychological traits. But the problem is, though, over half the suspects in the Zodiac Killer mystery will line up in terms of psychology and personality. And over half of the accusers have their reasons for saying that this symbol means this thing, and that these words are actually a clue to the Zodiac Killer's identity, and this is what the hidden meaning really is. Everybody has solutions to those things. What we need to hear is, how do you get your suspect to the crime scenes? What physical evidence do you have to tie them to the crime scenes? And on Kevin Robert Brooks's own channel, his guy, Donald Lee Bujok, formerly of Deer Lodge Prison in Montana, he had his fingerprints tested. He composed something which was a complete fingerprint reconstruction, and he got all of Donald Lee Bujok's fingerprints. I guess it was from the police department, and they had them compared with some from the Zodiac Killer, and by his own response, inconclusive, they did not match, they were not the same. However, though, when we interviewed Thomas Henry Horan on this channel, I asked him directly, what would you say to someone who believes that the Zodiac Killer was one person as opposed to the group murder theory, the multiple killers theory, or the Zodiac Killer hoax theory? And his response was, well, what he would say is that there was an FBI report that talked about how every single crime scene in the Zodiac Killer mystery has fingerprints from a different person. The fingerprints are 100% inconsistent. That's the biggest thing that he would say, trying to persuade people that this was actually a group of people as opposed to a single person. But right now, what I would like to do is I would actually like to read something from Facebook, and I really haven't used Facebook too much when I've been looking into anything to do with the Zodiac Killer mystery. But this is from Kevin Robert Brooks, Zodiac, The Montana Connection. And Zodiac Killer victim Michael Bujok described the suspect at Blue Rock Springs Park shooting as a white male, short, possibly 5'8" or 5'9". He was real heavy-set, beefy build, not blubbery fat, but real beefy. Possibly 195 to 200 pounds, or maybe even larger. Short, curly brown hair, light brown actually, almost blonde, with a large face. Note that Donald Lee Bujok's face compared to the other kids in the class. That sentence just is kind of inserted in there. Again, follow the evidence. It's him. I've done the work. When he left prison, he was 230 pounds and stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, or 5'9.5", and he wore his hair in a short military cut, and it was light brown with a red tinge. About the physical descriptions, one of the things that we always have to remember is Michael Bujok was not the most reliable witness, and I mean, allegedly, he was wearing 3 layers of clothes on the 4th of July during the Blue Rock Springs shooting because he was a petty criminal. He would often break into people's houses. He was a burglar, and he would sell stolen things to people like Donald Warren Porter for money. And it's possible that he just completely fabricated all of his testimony. We have to bear that in mind. That is not a frivolous accusation. It's very likely that Mike Bujok was an unreliable witness. He is definitely a victim in the Zodiac Killer case, and it's most likely the Zodiac Killer definitely the Zodiac Killer was trying to murder him, and it is his own fortune that he survived, but he is still an unreliable witness all the same. So when you want to put that into some larger thing, what else has Kevin Robert Brooks said about Donald Lee Bujok and the physical description? He proposes the concept that Donald Lee Bujok was wearing a wig at the Lake Berryessa stabbing, because Lake Berryessa is the only time the Zodiac Killer wore the hood with the clip-on sunglasses. Now, what do we make of that? They talk about this in the book Zodiac Unmasked as well. It's possible that the Zodiac Killer was wearing a wig during some of these incidents. Well, what I can say is this just an example of what somebody is saying because their suspect doesn't seem to match the physical description? Well, maybe they were wearing a wig under their mask. We always have to think about that. And I don't think that that's a crazy accusation either, that people might be trying to force their theory. So when their suspect doesn't match a particular description, what they do is they kind of try to compose something new to almost fit the circular peg through a square hole, more or less, saying, well, he must have been wearing a wig underneath the Zodiac Killer hood at Lake Berryessa. What I think is actually much more interesting is something that Brooks has contributed by saying that Donald Lee Bujok was actually really good at sewing. He learned how to do it in prison, perhaps before, but he definitely did the sewing in prison. I thought that was something valuable. Now, if you want to partner that with some of the other things that we have going on with Donald Lee Bujok, somebody left me a comment once on one of the uploads when they said, who created the Zodiac Killer hood? Who, what, when, where, why, and how? And I was like, well, what do you mean? Who created the Zodiac Killer hood? It's like, who sewed it together? Who made this? Did a guy make this? I mean, isn't it strange that they put out a Zodiac Killer film in 1971 that has, a hood similar to that? And I think that was going down more of the pathway that they were planning on making a movie, and they thought if they created this real serial killer legend and even committing real murders, it would have done better things for their movie. And there is the Zodiac Killer movie from 1971 that is available on YouTube for free that you can see. And, I never really thought much, well, we need a guy who knows how to sew, I guess. And, well, Donald Lee Bujok knew how to sew, and he probably knew cross-stitch and needlepoint or something like that. I don't even know what those are, so I shouldn't say them, cross-stitch and needlepoint. I couldn't tell you the difference. I mean, you put a needle through some cloth, I guess. I shouldn't speculate too much on that. But what I would also like to say is that I think that about Donald Lee Bujok talking about slaves in the afterlife and this thing about the Wheel of Death from the Tim Holt comics, what can we say about that? One of the things that is only loosely touched upon by the media is that the Church of Satan was becoming very popular in 1969. This whole thing about tying the Zodiac Killer into the occult, and I don't necessarily know if they're going down the right way. But when it comes to the 1960s, especially 1969, you deal with things like the Summer of Love and Flower Power and Peace, Love, and Joy and all of those things. From time to time, the media does bring up the fact that, yes, the Church of Satan was growing in San Francisco. We even had a little bit of that discussion when we mentioned Earl Van Best and the book by Gary Stewart, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, because they talk about an individual named Anton Lavey. I didn't remember his name, but I even looked him up and I realized I had seen him on VH1 as a kid when they talked about influences, satanic influences on the music industry. And this ties into some other things like Aleister Crowley. And one of the very convincing things is the Zodiac symbol has a very large similarity to a cross that was used by Aleister Crowley. And the whole point is, these things were widely believed in the 1960s. It isn't necessarily this type of underground shadow network of cult-like activity that people might try to make you think that it is. Instead, it's just that in addition to talking about flower power and peace, love, and joy, people also became familiar with things to do with, satanic rituals and such. Familiarity, that's all it is, as opposed to some cult-like shadow network. It was something that was widely discussed in the country at the time, and Donald Lee Bujok could have easily been pulled into that. Now, it's like, I don't know that 100%. I just want to say that there is this possibility that the occult connections to the Zodiac Killer are exaggerated and misinterpreted, if you will, because this could be things that were just much more casual than they would really have you believe. But, it's like, well, once again, the real big things we have to mention is that get some hard evidence to place this person at the crime scene, because anybody can look at all of the sort of words and symbols and try to read between the lines. And I think there's a lot of that on Kevin Robert Brooks' channel. It's still very, very impressive presentations. I mean, I really like listening to him talk. I really liked going through his video series. But at the same time, by his own admission, the fingerprints did not match. However, though, there could be some major things that we could learn about the true crime world from an individual like Donald Lee Bujok. Notice that name, Donald Lee Bujok. That card that was mailed to Paul Avery was spelled Averly, Averly. So he thinks that could be a clue to this guy's middle name, Lee. And you open up the card and it says Boo for Booyok. And that's what I was like, oh my God. Every time I say that, it's like the shock value does not go away. I'm really not so sure about that one, or that the skeleton on the Halloween card is wearing a pumpkin, and one of the things that the conquistadors would wear were called pumpkin breeches, and he is donning the pumpkin breeches. Like, Don is a name to wear. Don, Lee, Boo. I'm not so sure about that, but one thing that I would say that I thought was a genuine, insightful statement, a genuinely insightful statement, was that the Zodiac leaves these things at the end of his letters, plus 12, plus 13, plus 37. And there actually could be a clue that when the Zodiac Killer said that he had murdered 37 people, it's possible that that was not even a true body count. Almost nobody would think that that is a true body count of the Zodiac Killer. Instead, that could simply be the killer's age at the time, that he was 37 years old. And, of course, there are some more complicated reasons why Brooks thinks this way. And I would highly recommend his video series to anyone who just wants to hear what he has to say. And I like learning about Donald Lee Bujok, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about him in the future. But as of now, there was a question that was asked at the end of this upload on Donald Lee Bujok on the Zodiac Killer channel. Once again, please check out their documentary, Obsession into Darkness. But one of the questions that was asked was, is this purely a circumstantial case against Bujok? And I would say, yes. And Brooks even talked about that on the channel when he's like, circumstantial evidence is often discredited, but when it piles up, it can prove overwhelming. Circumstantial evidence can prove overwhelming. And I'm like, sure. Absolutely. I definitely agree. People have been convicted on circumstantial cases, and even better, us in the general public, like, sometimes you follow along with a circumstantial case and you're like, this makes sense to me, whereas this, other circumstantial case does not make sense. But at the same time, with a case like the Zodiac Killer, 2,000 suspects or something, like, the list gets bigger and bigger, and that doesn't even count the alternative suspects, mind you. So it's like, well, the thing that I would just say is that hard evidence is very much necessary. I often quote the historian Patricia Crone when she said, never substitute torturous reasoning for hard evidence. Never substitute torturous reasoning for hard evidence. And that is exactly the situation that we are dealing with here with Donald Lee Bujok. It's not to say that all the claims that Brooks is making, maybe he's 100% right about them, but at the same time, I would need much more evidence before I would accept something like that. However, though, in the future, when we do an upload on Donald Lee Bujok, I would really just like to look at him more as a person and look at the things involved with his psychological development going on to becoming a criminal, because I find that Robert Christian Hansen, the serial killer from Alaska known as the Butcher Baker, has a lot of similarities to Bujok, and you can see all of these things, whether it's abusive parents or growing up with a stutter, and we can look at some of those things and just learn more about the true crime world. I said, though, our uploads on Robert Christian Hansen, maybe there isn't actually a Zodiac Killer connection there, but that really became sort of a turning point on the channel and how we began to view things associated with the true crime world. Please drop any comments you have to say in the section below. Once again, you can hit that like button. It really helps out the channel. And I will see you on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.